Coming up, as to any politician who actually swore that oath but believed the contention that the New York Times is peddling in the 1619 Project, that our democracy's ideals were false when they were written, I think you could make a good argument that they falsely swore allegiance to the Constitution. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's start with a very brief discussion of something that's really a follow-on from our discussion last week. Last week's episode was entitled Climate Change Follow the Money, and I revealed how skeptical I am of the over-the-top claims made by climate change activists. I want to footnote that discussion with something I read recently. Have you ever met someone who manages to connect everything to one specific issue? Now, I'll admit that I've had my fair share of obsessions over the years. For decades, I was frankly obsessed with fishing, but it simply meant that I spent an awful lot of time thinking about it, talking about it, preparing to do it, and unfortunately far too little time actually fishing. But I never found a way to connect every issue to it. You could easily argue that I'm obsessed with politics, and it's much easier to connect everything to politics than fishing. But even there, I don't do it. I can have a conversation about college football or my favorite dinner spot and never have politics enter the discussion. Now, promising that I won't discuss politics at dinner is another matter entirely. But an article I read recently in the New Yorker magazine is the best example I've seen in a while of someone who manages to connect everything to his favorite issue. In fact, he takes it even further. He takes what I suspect may be all of his favorite political issues and connects them to his most favorite political issue. That issue, of course, is climate change. The article is entitled, "What If We Stop Pretending? The Climate Apocalypse is Coming. To prepare for it, we need to admit that we can't prevent it," by Jonathan Franzen in the September 8, 2019 edition of The New Yorker. Now, I have to admit that there is a certain logic that if you buy into the alarmist claims of climate change activists and you evaluate the sort of extreme, economy-destroying efforts worldwide that it would take to have a significant impact and actually prevent the climate change apocalypse they foretell, the most logical conclusion is that it can't be prevented, so prepare for it instead. As I noted last week, I am actually quite skeptical of those claims of climate alarmists predicting a climate apocalypse. After concluding that a war against climate change is not winnable, the author concludes that to maintain a stable society while addressing the impacts of climate change, quote, any movement toward a more just and civil society can be considered a meaningful climate action. Securing fair elections is a climate action. Shutting down the hate machines on social media is a climate action. Instituting humane immigration policy, advocating for racial and gender equality, promoting respect for laws and their enforcement, supporting a free and independent press, ridding the country of assault weapons. These are all meaningful climate actions. Close quote. You catch that? He took an entire string of primarily left-wing positions and concluded that they constitute, quote, meaningful climate action, close quote. You might say, well, some of those aren't really left-wing positions. What about supporting a free and independent press or securing fair elections? Well, what do those mean from a policy standpoint? There have been proposals from the left over the years arguing for government support of newspapers and local television and radio, for example, and securing fair elections. From the left, that usually takes the form of contending that voter ID laws are unfair and amount to disenfranchisement, for example. Imagine for a moment if a conservative or Republican were to take an issue and contend that an entire laundry list of seemingly disconnected Republican positions need to be accepted because of that issue. For example, what if a Republican argued that because of crime committed by illegal immigrants, in addition to building a border wall, we also need to abolish the inheritance tax, restrict abortion, allow prayer in public schools, make concealed carry permits effective across state lines, and prohibit consideration of race in college admissions? He'd be laughed at, as he should be. There's no connection between those issues. But the New Yorker published this article, and I expect the author saw nothing illogical in his argument, just the latest example of someone living in a bubble. Incidentally, when you combine what this author pulled with the acknowledgement by some that the Green New Deal is more about remaking the U.S. economy than it is about environmental protection, it really makes you wonder just how much you can trust explanations from the left about anything that gets characterized as an emergency. As Rahm Emanuel once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. Next topic. Betting on truth or lie. The Democrat presidential primary has a dynamic that seems really strange. It concerns the frontrunner, Joe Biden. As we all know, Biden is being portrayed as a moderate, as the candidate most capable of beating Donald Trump. That portrayal is almost exclusively based on Joe Biden's past. If you look at his positions now, they really aren't moderate. Among other things, he supports a public option for health insurance available to everyone with significantly increased government subsidies, spending $1.7 trillion fighting climate change, nearly 30 times the amount Hillary Clinton had proposed, and he wants to abolish the death penalty. Now, given how far to the left the Democratic presidential candidates have moved this year, I suppose you could argue that those proposals are moderate in the new Democratic Party. After all, Bernie Sanders is not only an avowed socialist, but his version of the Green New Deal comes with a $16 trillion price tag. But when taken historically, Biden's proposals are far to the left. So why is he being touted as a moderate? Well, that's what his campaign wants. Do you really expect the media to label him as a leftist extremist? Of course they won't. Because if they did, what on earth would they say about the other leading candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren? So is Biden only a moderate because much of the rest of his party has moved so far to the left that even his leftist positions look moderate? I think it's something more than that. I think that much of the support for Joe Biden comes from traditional moderate and liberal Democrats, not full-on leftists, who don't really buy what Joe Biden is selling with his current positions. I think the more traditional Democrats believe that's not the real Joe Biden. I think they believe the Joe Biden from the past, the somewhat moderate one, the one that supported capital punishment, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and had a history of compromising. I think they believe that basically he's lying when he espouses the more leftist positions. I think they're counting on him moving to the center if he were the Democratic nominee and somehow managed to win the general election. Conversely, I think the serious leftists in the party that have chosen to support him think he's telling the truth, that he really has moved that far to the left. So strangely, you have a candidate whose support is comprised not just of people who believe what he's saying, but also people who believe he's lying, and they don't have a problem with that. And I think Joe Biden knows it, and he's trying to thread that fine line. In between coughing fits, slurring his words, and trying to prevent his teeth from falling out, I think he's doing a reasonably competent job of walking a line that will convey to those on the left that he's of a mind with them, and to those more toward the center that he's not being honest with the left and is really more like them. Is it possible to continue that act all the way to success at the convention? I don't know, but it's going to be fun to watch him try. Next topic. The 1619 Project. I've made no secret that I've lost respect for the New York Times. In a previous episode, I even compared the paper of record to a squeaking, malfunctioning fishing reel. But critical as I was in that episode, nothing quite prepared me for how disturbed I was when I read Andrew Sullivan's takedown of the paper on NewYorkMag.com in the September 13 edition. That's nymag.com. In an article entitled "The New York Times Has Abandoned Liberalism for Activism." Sullivan criticizes the New York Times Magazine's 1619 project regarding the legacy of slavery in America. I heard about the project and the commitment of the Times to focus on its contention that the legacy of slavery is embedded throughout our society. I've read the speculation that the project is an attempt to tee up discussions of racism as part of the opposition campaign of the Democratic Party against President Trump. And I believe that is in fact a key reason why the New York Times chose to launch the project. But I hadn't delved much into the specifics of the claims and the writings that comprise the project. Andrew Sullivan has done that, and it's profoundly disturbing, especially given that the Times is presenting those writings and the underlying theory which they espouse as Sullivan notes, quote, authoritative truth in a newspaper people rely on for some gesture towards objectivity, close quote. Now, if you've listened to my prior episode on the Times, you'll know that I don't think it engages in any gestures towards objectivity. But as Sullivan points out, the handling of the 1619 project has moved the Times into the realm of full-on propaganda. So what exactly is the 1619 Project? It's a project consisting of writings re-examining the legacy of slavery in the United States, with 1619 being the year when slaves first arrived. The essays argue, among other things, that the year 1619, rather than 1776, should be viewed as the date on which the United States of America was founded. Basically, the Times is arguing that slavery was such an intrinsic part of America that its beginning on the continent must be viewed as the date in which the country was formed. That we revolted against the British so that we could ensure that slavery would continue. As Sullivan explains the contention, the nation, quote, was founded in defense of slavery and white supremacy, which was masked by highfalutin rhetoric about universal freedom, close quote. And, quote, all that rhetoric about liberty, progress, prosperity, toleration was a distraction to perpetuate those lies and make white people feel better about themselves, close quote. You think Sullivan's exaggerating just how extreme are the contentions of the writers in the 1619 Project? Get a load of the opening line of the first essay, quote, our democracy's ideals were false when they were written, close quote. Not just the Founding Fathers expressing the ideals were hypocritical because blacks were enslaved at the time. No, it actually says that the ideals themselves were false. As Sullivan points out, that makes no sense, and he thankfully notes that those ideals, quote, were in fact the most revolutionary leap forward for human freedom in history, close quote. The executive editor of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, even admitted that one of the reasons for the project was to, quote, teach our readers to think a little bit more like that, close quote. In other words, as Sullivan points out, to think a little bit more like neo-Marxists, believing that, quote, the core truth of human society is that it's composed of invisible systems of oppression based on race, sex, gender, etc., and that liberal democracy is merely a mask to conceal this core truth, and that a liberal society must therefore be dismantled to secure racial/social justice, close quote. Sullivan says he considers that to be a legitimate worldview, just not one presented as the Times presents it, as the only way to understand our history and as something that constitutes authoritative truth. Sullivan doesn't go far enough. The neo-Marxist view is a recipe to destroy a country. It simply takes race, gender, and other intrinsic characteristics that divide us and substitutes them for the economic divisions of the failed ideology of communism, which left 100 million corpses stacked across the 20th century. So we now have the paper of record, the most prestigious, prominent, storied newspaper in America, espousing a view that the country is rotten to the core and was rotten from its inception, which it contends occurred nearly 150 years before it was actually formed, instead of acknowledging the actual and obvious history. That the United States was formed based on revolutionary concepts of individual freedom and democratic government that were flawed in the execution because of the obvious hypocrisy in their conflict with human bondage, a sin that it took an overwhelmingly bloody civil war to try to cleanse, but which kept coming back in the form of Jim Crow laws and enduring racism, a racism that no doubt still exists among some individuals, but that is no longer systemic within our government and societal structures. Think about the level of influence of the New York Times. Newspapers are nowhere near as prominent in society as they once were. They're falling by the wayside at a frightening pace. But the New York Times is still the trigger, the source, the influencer that spawns story after story across the country in other newspapers, on television networks, on local television and media of all kind. That a newspaper with that level of influence is peddling this garbage, that democratic ideals in America were false from the beginning, not that we didn't live up to them, but that the ideals themselves were false and a cover-up so that we could perpetuate slavery, is profoundly disturbing. Those ideals, those democratic principles, are what make America what it is. Those ideals are in force in the economy as well as in the government. They are the reason why we are the most powerful nation in the history of the earth. That marketplace of ideas which produces the best products, services, and programs, the democratic principles which give us the confidence that we have a say in our lives and help bind us together even when we disagree vociferously about who should win an election. All of those created America and made it the land to which millions of immigrants aspire. Think back over the years when you first heard various ideas. It's hard to pinpoint the years in many instances, but you just remember it was a long time ago. Think about the concept of political correctness and extreme sensitivity to language. 30 years ago, you really didn't have it. Back then, comedians, for example, said all sorts of things that would make your jaw drop now. And the place where they were perhaps most accepted was on college campuses. Young students fed on those controversial and inappropriate but undeniably funny observations. Now college campuses are the least accepting of comedy which pushes the limits, and comedians such as Jerry Seinfeld and Bill Maher started to refuse to play college campuses. Think about when you first heard the thought expressed that offensive words were equivalent to violence. Now that's a ridiculous concept. Words are not a physical attack. But that ridiculous concept spread. Now you hear it expressed repeatedly by people trying to justify violence, most commonly on the left from groups like Antifa. Ideas can be dangerous. Ideas that seem ridiculous can spread, especially if advanced by prominent members of society. And the New York Times is no doubt a prominent member of our society. We shouldn't discount the 1619 Project. It is dangerous. It threatens to tear us apart. It threatens to undermine the very foundation of our society. Look at what the United States has achieved. Our economic, military, and political power is unprecedented. Our system obviously has worked incredibly well. Is it perfect? Of course not. But there's a huge difference between making proposals to improve a system which has been overwhelmingly successful and making proposals to throw it all out and start anew because you believe the entire system was a lie from the get-go. That belief is inherently destructive. Now think about that belief in the context of an elected official. Think about the prominence of the New York Times on the left. Do you think that Democrat politicians believe what the New York Times is publishing as part of the 1619 Project? Probably some of them do. Do you think that if it gains traction, more of them will believe it in the future? I do. Now think about the idea that our democracy's ideas were false when they were written. Think about the contention that the democratic principles and freedoms laid out in our founding documents were just a cover-up, a subterfuge so that we could perpetuate slavery. I think there's a legitimate question as to whether anybody who actually believes that could ever truthfully take the oath of office and swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. As to a politician who actually swore that oath, but believed the contention that the New York Times is peddling in the 1619 Project, that our democracy's ideals were false when they were written, I think you could make a good argument that they falsely swore allegiance to the Constitution. Acceptance of the arguments made by the New York Times undermines the foundation of our democracy, or more precisely, our constitutional republic. Both political parties need to condemn what the New York Times has written. Do I think the Democrat Party will? Not a chance on earth. Do I think the Republican Party will? Hopefully, although I fear that they may not, out of fear that the left will point at the party and for seemingly the millionth time scream racist. Let's see what happens. I'll be back next week with the next episode of Political Spirits, hopefully presented in a conversational tone and not a scream. In the interim, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits, and follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And I'd like to thank the listeners from some new areas. Alaska is a relatively recent addition to the States with Political Spirits listeners. Thanks for joining. And we've seen a jump in listeners from Australia as well. So we're well covered up north and down under too. We hope you continue to enjoy the podcast. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.